Hello everyone, my name is Kong Shrinani and welcome to my YouTube channel Neuro Chat with AG. On this channel, I plan to cover topics that are closest to my heart: autism, late autism diagnosis, and autism in women and girls. I will interview thought leaders, esteemed researchers, scientists, professors, doctors, and psychologists and seek their views and updates on their latest work and research. Lastly, keeping inclusivity as a topmost priority, we might also discuss controversial, disparate views for a collective understanding of issues and respect for diverse views. All the views and topics discussed are for informational purposes only. If you are interested in watching more quality content on this topic, please hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to press the bell icon to be notified whenever a new video is uploaded. Please also share the channel with your friends, family, and social media platforms. Thank you. Today, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Nick Walker, an accomplished professor of psychology, an Aikido teacher, and a neurodiversity scholar. Dr. Nick brings a unique perspective to the fields of psychology and education, emphasizing the importance of understanding and embracing neurodiversity in our society. In addition to her academic work, Nick is the co-creator of the popular webcomic Weird Luck, which combines adventure and intrigue with explorations of diversity and consciousness. Her insights into human development and her commitment to promoting human potential make her a leading voice in the neurodiversity movement. Dr. Walker is also the author of Neuroqueer Heresies, which is a collection of essays that explore the intersections of neurodiversity, identity, and society, challenging conventional narratives around autism and queerness. With a rich background in psychology and martial arts, Dr. Walker is dedicated to helping others harness their strengths and navigate the complexities of life. Join me as we delve into her experience, ideas, and impactful work that she continues to do around neurodiversity. Dr. Walker, welcome, and thank you very much for the time today.
Thank you for having me here.
And to kind of jump right into it, how do you define neurodiversity?
Yes. Neurodiversity is the diversity or variation among human body minds. And I like to use this term body minds. I've heard people talk about neurodiversity as diversity of brains, but I think that's overly simplistic with what we know about uh, how humans work. You know, the brain is not isolated where our consciousness is embodied. Our cognitive processes are intimately entwined with our embodiment. And the brain is connected to the entire body by this network of miles and miles of nerves. There's this feedback process continually where the brain takes in sensory information from the body, and the brain is continually rewired and altered by our bodily experiences and our bodily actions. So I don't think of human bodies as vehicles that carry brains around. I think, we are body minds. We're bodies that think. And so when people hear the neuro and neurodiversity, and we think about neurology and neuroscience, and we usually think, oh, neuro is brain, but neuro means nerve. Neuro refers really to the whole nervous system and that the whole way the body-mind system functions. So I think of neurodiversity really not just as a diversity of brains, but a diversity of body minds and a diversity of modes of cognition, including how cognition is embodied.
How do you define neurodivergence? Would you say there's a difference?
Yeah, neurodiversity and neurodivergence are two very different things, because neurodiversity is encompasses everybody on the planet. Every single human being is part of the spectrum of neurodiversity. And, it's like any other sort of diversity. I mean, if you talk about ethnic diversity, like there's no one who doesn't have some sort of ethnic background. There's nobody who, your cultural diversity, there's nobody who doesn't have a culture of some kind. Um, there's nobody who doesn't have some sort of gendered experience, all of that, or diversity of human heights. People come in different sizes, and it's not like, oh, there's somebody who doesn't have a size, who doesn't have a height. So neurodiversity is everybody, all people. Neurodivergence is specifically uh, divergence from the dominant neurocognitive norms. And so, uh, you know, there's um, there are there's no such thing as a normal mind, a normal body, a normal brain, any of that. There's no such thing as a normal person, but cultures construct norms, and they change from place to place, and they change over time as culture and society evolve. But at any given time, there are certain norms that dominate at certain ways. Oh, this is the way that we think, that normal people think. And so neurodivergence is any really significant divergence from whatever the dominant cognitive norms are at the time, um, which is very broad. That's a very broad, it's a very broad concept. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. They use the term often um, to mean uh, just like um, the particular forms of innate genetic neurodivergence that are commonly pathologized these days. So when people say neurodivergence, um, sometimes they're using the term too narrowly. They're misusing it to mean like just this small cluster of things, autism and ADHD and dyslexia and a handful of other things. But I'm actually old friends with Cassiana Asasumasu, who coined the term. So I know very well what she meant by it, because she's been very clear about that. She really meant neurodivergence is any significant divergence from dominant cognitive norms. So that includes innate neurodivergence, like autism and ADHD and dyslexia. It also includes innate forms of neurodivergence that are not commonly pathologized and that you don't find in the DSM, for instance, like synesthesia or aphantasia. And it also includes acquired neurodivergence. So, for instance, traumatic brain injury is a form of neurodivergence, or Alzheimer's, uh, PTSD, all of these things um, are acquired. Something occurs to change the cognitive functioning and take it outside of the realm of the dominant norms. And that also includes intentionally acquired neurodivergence. So, which is something that we don't talk about a lot, because the neurodiversity sort of the concept became popularized, was developed in the context of like the autistic civil rights movement, and which expanded into the neurodiversity movement. And a lot of that is very focused around disability rights, and how autistic people are disabled through lack of accommodation and such. And so a lot of work around neurodiversity has focused on populations that are pathologized or populations that are disabled. But neurodivergence is not limited to that. So neurodivergence includes, for instance, people who have altered their consciousness permanently with psychedelics, or people who've permanently altered their consciousness through meditation. So neurodivergence is a very big category that, again, people frequently use too narrowly. And one thing that I'm a stickler about when I teach courses on neurodiversity is, if you mean autism or you mean autism and ADHD and dyslexia or something like that, use those terms. Don't use neurodivergence as a euphemism, because neurodivergence is big and includes there's so many ways to be neurodivergent, and not all of them have anything to do with disability or pathology.
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, and your work advocates for the understanding of autism as a natural human variation. So,
Mm-hmm.
what are some misconceptions you think persist about autism, and how can we challenge them?
I think one of the big misconceptions is um, still we have this idea kicking around, thanks to some not non-autistic, sort of self-appointed autism experts like Simon Baron-Cohen. Um, uh, there's this idea that autistic people are somehow deficient in empathy or deficient in this thing called theory of mind. And this isn't actually true. And this my colleague Damien Milton, a great British autism scholar, talks about the double empathy problem, where you know autistic people um, have a hard time understanding non-autistic people, and because they think very differently, and non-autistic people have a very difficult time understanding autistic people. But because autistic people are a pathologized minority group, that always gets blamed on autistic people. So it's like if an autistic person has trouble understanding a non-autistic person, it gets blamed on some deficiency the autistic person has. But if a non-autistic person has trouble understanding an autistic person, that also gets blamed on some deficiency the autistic person has. And really, the truth is, it's just harder to understand someone who thinks differently from you, whose cognitive processes and embodiment and body language are different from you. It's a cross-cultural communication issue. It works with the same kind of challenges as cross-cultural communication, but again, because it's the dominant conversation on autism has started from the assumption that autism is some sort of deficit or pathology. It just gaps in understanding, gaps in mutual reciprocal understanding get blamed on autism or autistic people rather than understood as, oh, this is another issue of people who think differently from each other have to do extra work to understand each other. So that theory of mind, empathy thing, that's got to go. That's a common misconception that's still kicking around. Um, that I'm looking forward to that finally being dispelled, but these myths take a while to dissipate in the culture, even after they've been debunked. Um, and I think there's still people who are looking for causes of autism. There's still people who think autism is they start from this idea that autism is a pathology or a defect of some kind, and then from there they think, oh well, pathology must have a cause, and so there's there's still people who think that autism is caused by vaccines, even though that's been debunked over and over again for decades. And constantly, there's still like regular newspaper articles thinking they found a cause, but it doesn't have a cause any more than like a person's uh genetic traits that identify them as a member of a particular ethnic heritage or something has a cause. It's just genes. It's just human genetic variation. um and one more thing, um is this is subtle, but the idea of autism as, every autistic person is different. There's such a huge variation among autistic people. And um, the idea of autism as a pathology and autistic people as, consistently disabled occurs because only the autistic people who are having trouble of some kind, who are having trouble fitting in some way, or have some noticeable impairment, or are disabled, you need some special accommodation, those are the only autistic people who are getting diagnosed. And so uh, I think that there are plenty of autistic people who are just were born into the right circumstances or with the right particular configuration of autism to just be doing fine in their lives. And so they never get diagnosed. And so we get a distorted impression of autism as something dire based on which parts of the autistic population get diagnosed.
Yeah, that's definitely food for thought. How has your background as a psychologist influenced your perspective on things like the neurodiversity paradigm, um, in comparison to the old kind of medical model of understanding and I know this is a general term, but neurodivergent individuals.
Yeah. Um, Well, you can probably tell every time I answer a question that I'm definitely thinking about this in psychology terms. I'm always kind of evoking like the neuropsychology of it or the developmental psychology of it. I think, you know, as a psychologist, I think a lot about cognition. I do a lot of metacognition, a lot of thinking about how people think and how cognition and perception works. And so um, that's a lot of the discourse on autism, especially by non-autistic people, if you look like even how it's diagnosed, is about looking at external signs. But I've always been very interested with any form of neurodivergence. What's going on under the hood? What's the actual cognitive process here? What is the distinctive thing? What distinguishes the autistic consciousness, the autistic cognitive process, or the dyslexic consciousness, or whatever we're talking, whatever sort of neurodivergence we're talking about. Um, and two things that I'm very aware of from my psychology background. One is that the field of psychology has a history of enforcing whatever the dominant norms are. So just because something is, in the diagnostic manuals and talked about as if it's a disorder, doesn't mean that it's a problem that needs to be eradicated or that can be fixed or should be fixed. It just means that it's outside of the norm enough that someone decided that it was a pathology. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing about, when we look at diagnostic manuals like the DSM, most people think that they're scientific in some way. And the truth that people in the field of psychology know, if they look deep enough into how the field works, is that it's not really a scientific process at all. I mean, when the American Psychiatric Association puts together a new edition of the DSM, they have committees that like argue about diagnostic criteria and what the different diagnoses should and shouldn't be, and they vote on it, and it's basically a political process rather than a scientific process. So I because of that, I'm my attitude towards is something a pathology or not is, well, is it useful to think of it that way? Not what do the diagnostic manuals say, because I know that's just politics. So my interest is, for instance, I uh, I think that it is not useful to pathologize autism, because it's not something you can treat. You can't attempts to make autistic people non-autistic just end up doing harm. They're a waste of time and money and frequently harmful. With autism, it's makes much more sense to look at, does this autistic person need some sort of accommodation? Can we, if we, when we, once we accept this person's autistic, that's just naturally how they are genetically. How do we accommodate that? How do we give them the best quality of life we can? Whereas something like PTSD, also a form of neurodivergence, it makes sense to call out a pathology because it's treatable, and people with PTSD benefit from treatment, from attempts to get rid of the PTSD in a way that trying to get rid of autism does not benefit people. So that sort of nuance is crucial. I think that too often we see these two radical extremes of anything that's so-called abnormal must be a pathology that needs to be cured, and on the other side, the sort of anti-psychiatry movement extreme of saying nothing should ever be treated as a pathology. And I think if we're looking at utility and what actually helps people, we need to be a lot more nuanced than that. Um, Also, in terms of my psychology background, I'm very interested in how people change. I'm very interested in how minds change. And so um, a lot of the focus by neurodiversity movement activists and by neurodiversity scholars, a lot of the focus is just sort of on uh, study autistic people or study, dyslexic or ADHD people, and how do we accommodate them? How do we accommodate or work with or treat or whatever this particular form of neurodivergence? I'm really interested in acquired neurodivergence. I'm really interested in how people change their consciousness and change their cognitive processes through meditation and psychedelics and martial arts practice and other practices like that. I'm really interested. Okay, well, you have an autistic body mind. What can you do with it? What are its potentials if you engage in certain practices? So that's, I think, a different perspective. It's more of, I guess, less as some of the cognitive psychologists say. It's less of a fixed mindset and more of a growth mindset.
Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about your literature. So, Weird Luck, which combines speculative fiction, surrealism, and themes of neurodiversity. Um, you know, so about that, like, what inspired you to start the webcomic, and how do you use it to kind of do what you set out to do with it?
Mm. I love talking about Weird Luck because it's my favorite project. It's my favorite thing that I do in life. I mean, neurodiversity scholarship is just sort of something I fell into by accident by being involved in autistic community from very early on. Um, uh, but comics are something I've just always genuinely loved and always wanted to do. And uh, so I was, uh, my friend Andrew Reichart and I have been sort of collaborating and world building and playing tabletop role playing games and such, and generating story for all our lives, for like 40 years now. And we um, we've both published stories. Andrew's published a few novels, and I at some point, about more than 10 years ago now, it must be a dozen years or something. I We were just talking, and I love the webcomic medium. Um, and I just said, hey, let's do a comic. Let's do a webcomic. And of course, the big challenge with that is that uh, I used to draw a lot. I used to want to draw comics, but I'm out of the habit of drawing and don't really have time to teach myself again. But Andrew knew Mike Benowitz, who was a truly extraordinary artist, amazing artist, and he was up for collaborating with us. And so, yeah, we have this beautiful collaborative webcomic going, and it's just delightful. It's a very long-term project. It's really just getting started. There's a long way to go in this story. The prose fiction that Andrew and I write is all tied in with the comic. It's all sort of prequels and such to the comic storyline. And so, yeah, it's a delightful long-term project. I When I write fiction, including the comic, I am I'm not setting out to teach particular lessons. Like I'm not setting out like doing a comic about neurodiversity, for instance, doesn't interest me. I actually don't like art of any kind that tries to teach me a particular lesson or tries to instruct me. I just want a good story. So I'm just telling a story that I want to tell with characters that I'm into, but these themes of like queerness and neurodivergence and such inevitably show up just because that's something I think about a lot. And so I don't have like characters in the comic who I think like, oh, this is going to be an autistic character or something like that. But I'm always interested in, you know, what's this character's consciousness like? To be this kind of person, how would you have to think? How would you perceive things? Or, if you were a telepath or something, or if you were, or if you had extremely weird luck your whole life, um, how would that affect your consciousness? How would that affect your experience of reality and thus your personality? So that stuff inevitably shows up in the comic.
Regarding Neuroqueer heresies. So it collects a lot of influential writings and new commentary by you on kind of this idea, this like neuroqueer theory.
Mhm.
So could you kind of explain what that is? And yeah.
Yeah. Neuroqueer theory is kind of the thing that really has become the focus of my scholarship and academic work these days. Essentially, um, it's queer theory extended to encompass neurodiversity, and so um, neurodiversity scholarship in general. Um, it's if it's by people who are looking at neurodiversity and people who are looking at neurodivergence in terms of pathology, people who think about autism as a pathology and or ADHD as a pathology, whatever, people who are coming from that perspective are writing about it usually using the language of psychology or psychiatry or medicine or something like that. Um, people in the neurodiversity movement, scholars and activist writers within the neurodiversity movement who are like, don't try to force neurotypicality on people, but find accommodations, find ways to accommodate and include neurodivergent people. They're usually writing from a disability studies perspective, and sort of grounded in the disability rights movement and critical disability theory and such. I am coming from a different perspective. Obviously, my perspective is very influenced by psychology, but also by queer theory and this queer theory lens. And if you look at queer theorists like Judith Butler, writing about gender, um, they are talking about really what does it mean to diverge from established norms, and the idea that, well, there's no such thing as a normal gender or a normal sexuality. There's these socially constructed gender roles, including sexual roles that are imposed on people from birth, pretty much, and people are trained to perform these particular gender in a particular way. And so, queer theory is like very much about, well, what does it mean to queer the norms and to queer something, to queer this use of the term queer as a verb. And often these days people think of queer as like an identity label, but within queer theory, queer is primarily a verb. And even before it had anything to do with like, being gay or um, diverging from gender binaries, the word queer meant to to tangle something. Like you would say, like, oh, my fishing line is queered, it's tangled. So it was literally the opposite of straight in a very physical way. And so what does it mean to queer uh, gender norms? What does it mean to subvert gender norms, tamper with them in some way, liberate oneself from them, loosen the grip of socially learned and imposed gender norms? And so neuroqueer theory extends that to neuronormativity as well. This idea that, well, what it means to think and act like a so-called normal person. Um, this is also socially constructed and socially imposed. We neurodiversity scholars and activists talk about neurotypicality, about neurotypical people, meaning people who conform to the dominant norms. But there's no such thing as a neurotypical brain. That just doesn't exist. There's not really a brain type that like, oh, you were born with a normal brain. Um, Brains are very flexible, and obviously genetically there are some body minds that are just going to be autistic or going to be ADHD or dyslexic or something like that. But uh, the human body mind is extremely flexible, and so people are kind of wired neurologically to soak up culture and to learn to conform to whatever cultural norms they're surrounded by. And so neurotypicality is something that people learn. The performance of normal cognition is something that people learn, um, and it shapes the brain, shapes the nervous system, but that can all be reshaped too. And so that's what really interests me. Like, okay, sure, if you're autistic or something, if you're innately neurodivergent in some way, well, what does it mean to embrace that and actively subvert the performance of normativity and be like, I'm just really going to embrace what it and find out the full potentials of what it means for me to be autistic and what I can do with this. But also, more importantly, for anybody, including, so-called neurotypical or so-called normal people, um, what can anybody do uh, to expand their consciousness and expand their cognitive processes beyond the dominant cultural norms? And so yeah, that's what I'm really about these days in terms of my neurodiversity work is this neuroqueer theory, is this idea of queering not only gender norms, which I love to do, but also queering neurocognitive norms and saying, well, how can we creatively liberate ourselves from normality in order to discover more of our potentials and more of the things that our consciousness can do.
And you've also written and spoken about the importance of neurocosmopolitanism. So can you tell us what,
Yeah.
yeah, so can you tell us
Yes.
about that?
Yeah. So So I was thinking, looking at neurodiversity activism, um, you know, um, the way activism happens, especially on social media these days, and really for the past couple decades, um, it's very focused on what's wrong and what needs to be fixed. And often, activists of any sort, often there's a very angry tone. You look at Twitter or something like that, or whatever, any social media platform. And activism often is very angry and very grievance oriented. And of course, there are wrongs that need to be righted and injustices that need to be addressed. I understand that, but I'm not a particularly angry person, and I'm much more motivated by curiosity and by positive goals. And so, um, what I got to thinking while I was immersed in the world of neurodiversity activism was, what is the goal? What are we working towards? We're fighting against all these things, right? We're fighting against people who, inflict harmful treatments on autistic children, trying to make them, less autistic in some way. We're against, exclusion of autistic people from educational environments or job opportunities. Sure, we're against these things, but what are we for? What do we want? What's the goal? What would it look like if the whole world did embrace the neurodiversity paradigm? And so my answer was neurocosmopolitanism. And what the idea is, we have this concept in the world of cosmopolitanism, and cosmopolitanism is an attitude toward cultural diversity. And so the opposite of cosmopolitanism would be, I guess, provincialism, right? And a person whose attitude is provincial, it's like this person has grown up in one particular area and one very specific culture, and they've never really interacted with people outside of their culture. And so they think of their culture as the normal culture. And everyone else is just weird and exotic. And um, they, there's kind of that attitude of like, oh, I don't have an accent. Everybody else has an accent, but I talk normal. And so it's the opposite of that provincial attitude is the cosmopolitan attitude of there's no such thing as a normal culture. There's there's just cultural diversity, and cultural diversity is rich and has an opportunity for continual growth and learning and synergy. It's like, oh, my culture isn't any more normal than anybody else's. Like, other people's cultures are very foreign to me, and my culture is very foreign to them. And if we approach this with an attitude of humility and curiosity, everybody ends up learning from each other, and we all grow from this experience of cultural diversity and cultural hybridity, and what sort of creative synergy happens when two cultures meet. And that's, so that's cosmopolitanism. So I thought, well, um, let's apply that idea to neurodiversity, because there's no normal mind. Just like there's no normal culture, there's no such thing as a normal mind. And so what if, instead of thinking about, well, who's normal and who needs to be pathologized, or just, well, everybody's mind is different, and what does it mean to approach that with an attitude of curiosity, with a sense of nobody's normal. My mind isn't any more or less normal than anybody else's. It's just there's this wild diversity to learn about. And it's like, if you have a cosmopolitan attitude towards culture, maybe it means that you're very frequently up for, you want to try the cuisines and the music and the cultural traditions of lots of different cultures, and respectfully sort of approach them and be like, wow, what is this? What is this new thing this thing that's new to me, but it's a part of these other people's ancient culture. What can I offer them? What can they offer me? Um, wow, like a kind of food it never occurred to me to try eating before, a kind of music I've never heard before, a way of dancing I've never done before, a new approach to literature. Let me try to understand and experience this new culture. And what if we had that same attitude toward minds? Oh wow, this person's perspective, instead of meeting someone and saying, oh, this person must be deficient or defective or something like that because I don't understand how they think. It's like, oh wow, I don't understand how this person thinks. I really want to learn more about it. I want to have a lot of conversations with this person and hear what they have to say and sort of see how much I can try on their consciousness and learn from it and how much we can learn from each other. And so that's the neurocosmopolitan attitude is embracing neurodiversity the way the most open-minded people embrace cultural diversity.
And I kind of wanted to ask, um, how do you view the future of the whole neurodiversity movement in terms of like social acceptance and structural changes in different fields and also in within the movement itself?
Well, the funny thing is, increasingly, I don't feel a sense of being part of the neurodiversity movement. I feel because that's very much an activist movement, and I feel less like an activist and more like a scholar and a futurist. I'm very focused on um, the future we can build and um, the realization of human potential and on uh, um, less on the activist side. And of course, there's still important activism to be done. Um, but I think that if the purpose if the purpose of the neurodiversity movement was to spread the concept of neurodiversity, get people um, accepting the idea of neurodiversity, that we are just a neurocognitively diverse species and a neurocognitively diverse society, and we need to look at what that means and how to accommodate neurominority groups like autistic people, for instance. Um, in a sense, the neurodiversity movement has been succeeding at that. I mean, I do, when I started getting known as, um, as an educator and scholar and speaker on neurodiversity, and I would get speaking gigs, and it would be like, come talk to this college class or this like uh, group of therapists or something like that, and you know, we'll we'll pay you a little bit to come and talk about this novel concept. Um, I have the people who have brought me in to speak this year are like, I mean, over the past few years, it's like, Johns Hopkins University, London School of Economics, Amazon, Microsoft, speaking at for to Paramount production company next week and Google next month. It's like um, interest in neurodiversity is mainstream now. It is like in academia, in the corporate world, it's something that's on people's radar. People want to be neurodiversity literate. They might not do a great job of it sometimes, um, but they might not understand exactly what neurodiversity uh, means, or the terms and concepts kind of developed by the early autistic neurodiversity activists. But they're trying. It's on the radar. And so in that sense, the neurodiversity movement has succeeded to a large degree. And I think that if it's going to continue to be useful, um, it may, I think it needs to diversify more as a movement, focus on very specific issues. I don't know if it makes sense to talk about the neurodiversity movement anymore as a single blanket thing. I think it's more like, okay, well, we need the people who are focused on accommodating disabled neurodivergent people in educational environments or employment environments, the people who are focused on healthcare, the people who are focused on, making reforms and paradigm shifts in medicine and psychiatry. And I also think that, as sort of something I've touched on earlier in this conversation, we need to expand to um, uh, away from just activism in the political sense, in the sense of human rights activism, social justice activism. We need to expand also as a movement, to be meaningful, into the positive potentials, into how do we actually encourage neurocosmopolitanism, or how do we encourage people to move away from just thinking about neurodiversity in terms of, or neurodivergence in terms of, lists of identity categories or diagnoses or something, and think about this as like, okay, we're a neurodiverse species. Neurodiversity encompasses all human beings, and what can we do to expand human consciousness in general? What can we do to teach people to develop the unique potentials of their own consciousness in various ways? So I think in that sense, you know, there's different ways of interpreting the term movement, because there's the the disability rights movement, there's civil rights movements, and we've been thinking, I think, mostly thinking about neurodiversity, thinking about the neurodiversity movement in that sense as a civil rights or social justice movement. But I think we also need to think of neurodiversity movement in terms of like a movement towards realizing a greater portion of human potential. Back in the 70s, the term human potential movement was very big. This idea of like really exploring like the higher human potentials, people's potential for self-actualization and enlightenment and greater levels of wisdom and health and compassion and such. And I think we should be thinking about the neurodiversity movement that way too, in terms not just of fixing injustices or structural problems, but also developing positive human potentials.
I know you mentioned earlier in the question that you kind of consider yourself as more of a futurist. So what are some of, I guess, your kind of visions for the future?
I definitely a neurocosmopolitan future, a future where people embrace the idea that we do all think differently. And we really see a need for that right now, because the political landscape is so polarized. And you have you have people who have different political beliefs and religious beliefs and such, especially around politics and social issues, looking at people who are disagree with them and thinking, well, anybody who's not on my side must be crazy, must just not be capable of thinking clearly. And there's so much hostility and so little curiosity. And so, in terms of future visions, I think that has to change. I mean, and I think that the polarization is getting about as extreme as it can get. And I think I'm optimistic that in the coming generations, we're going to see a shift towards more, well, if we're going to function together, a world of like growing crisis, growing like climate crisis and such. If we're going to create a sustainable future together as a species, we've got to be able to collaborate better. And to do that, we have to recognize everybody thinks differently from each other. And there's people who maybe have, think differently enough from the dominant norms that they get a diagnosis of autism or something. But I think any two individuals are probably more different from each other than they can imagine in a way. And I think that accepting neurodiversity as not just being about, oh, some people are autistic or dyslexic or something, but no, every single human is wildly unique in their consciousness. I think that's a good starting point towards building a future where people are like genuinely curious with anyone they meet. How do you think? How do you, let's work out a common language. Let's assume that we do not experience the world the same way at all. And let's get to know each other better, and let's get to know one another's realities better and learn from it. And I think that's the future. I think I call myself a queer futurist sometimes because I think that the future really lies a sustainable future for humanity, a positive future for humanity. The path really lies in liberating ourselves from the whole notion of normal and from imposed normativity and gender norms and cognitive norms and all of these and existing categories, categories of like nationality and racial categories, all of these things. People are locked into these fixed, rigid identities and the conflicts that come with them. And any kind of sustainable future involves queering that dramatically. It involves really subverting anything that stands in the way of our curiosity and connection.
Dr. Walker, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude for taking the time to speak with me. I genuinely appreciate your willingness to share all of these insights and kind of experiences you've had as an autistic individual, as someone who's part of the LGBTQ plus community, and your expertise in psychology and martial arts. This was a really enlightening and inspiring conversation, and I'm looking forward to reading the Weird Luck webcomic.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. So
Well,
thank you again.
thank you so much for this conversation. It's really been a pleasure meeting you and speaking with you.